It is great to be here with you today. The MRA has been really busy in the month of May. As you know, May is Melanoma and Skin Cancer Awareness Month, and we've been doing many educational programs as well as fun activities for the melanoma community. But in this program today, I'm so very excited that we will share with you information on the latest drug approval for melanoma patients. It's called AMTAGVI, and it is what we call a tumor infiltrating lymphocyte therapy, also referred to as TILs. It's a cell-based therapy. And right now, it's with great pleasure that I have here with me Dr. Allison Betof Warner. She is a medical oncologist with the Cutaneous Oncology Program, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine, the Division of Medical Oncology at Stanford University. Dr. Betof Warner was also formerly at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, but why I'm so exciting is she is really, truly a leading pioneer and expert in TIL therapy. So welcome, Dr. Betof Warner.
Thank you, Joan. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So I'm going to just start off by saying that the field really has made some incredible progress in bringing forward treatments to melanoma patients. 17 new drug approvals in probably a little over 12 years. That is absolutely remarkable progress to the field. We brought forward immunotherapies and what we call targeted therapies that are geared towards a specific biomarker in a patient's tumor. Just really exciting progress. But even with this progress, our work's not over. You know that, because only about approximately 50% of melanoma patients respond to these new exciting treatments. So it really makes a clear unmet medical need to bring new therapies to the other 50% that are not benefiting from the drug approvals. So this approval of this TIL therapy, AMTAGVI, really brings a new ray of hope to melanoma patients. So just to set the stage for today, this conversational program will be run. I'm going to ask Dr. Betof Warner several questions about this new therapy, but I'll save time at the end for anyone who's on the call to submit questions and comments, and we will ask her those questions. I just want everyone to be mindful that the questions you submit be geared to the topic being discussed today, because we really can't address any personal medical questions. So with that, I'm going to kick off with my first question to you, which is, so what is this TIL therapy and how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So TIL therapy, first and foremost, is not a new concept. This is a new approval, but this has been going on since the late 1980s and was pioneered by Dr. Steve Rosenberg at the National Cancer Institute. And what we have now is essentially 40 years worth of work that has led to this approval. So the idea here is when we give classic immunotherapy that many of our patients have had, we're giving antibodies that go through the body to spin up as many T cells as possible, but they may not be the ones specific to a patient's tumor. And so when that doesn't work, the idea behind TILs is to find the T cells that are specific to a patient's tumor. So we do a surgery, we take out a piece of a patient's tumor. Right now, that still is a surgery. So we take out somewhere between 1.5 and 4 centimeters of tumor to try to get enough of those T cells. Those get shipped to the company that manufactures these TILs. That company is called Iovance. And they expand those TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, trying to get somewhere between 7.5 and 72 billion of those T cells that are specific to a patient's tumor. So this that you're seeing here is an overview of the process. So we just talked about that surgery, then the expansion, and that process takes 35 days to expand those cells. And then what we get back is a frozen bag or multiple bags of those T cells. At that point, a patient undergoes a period of chemotherapy. That chemotherapy does not treat the melanoma. It's not aimed at the melanoma. The goal is to get rid of the immune cells that would compete with the good ones that we're going to give back, and to basically prepare the body to get these TILs and to use them well. So that chemotherapy sometimes is done inpatient and sometimes is done outpatient, depending on where the patient is treated. Followed by the next day, you actually get the TIL infusion, and that is just an IV drip of these cells that usually goes in over about a period of an hour. And that is then followed by up to 6 doses of a medicine called high-dose IL-2. And anyone who's been around melanoma for long enough knows that IL-2 actually was a medicine we used to give alone to treat melanoma. But its goal is to stimulate T cells. So this is actually needed to tell the body to take up those T cells and for them to be active. But patients will get somewhere between 1 and 6 doses of that, depending on how well they tolerate it. After that, patient remains in the hospital until their blood counts come back to a point where they are safe to go home. And that's usually somewhere in the 10-day to 2-week period of time. And we then follow the patient closely, but this is a one-time treatment. And that is the whole promise of this approach, that it is a big lift. There's no question about it. But it's something that we do once and can see durable responses to.
That's really incredible because, for all the other therapies, you have to get them once every few weeks, you're on a treatment schedule, and I know you said that it is a heavy lift. You have to get the lymphodepletion and then you have to get the infusion and IL-2, but at least then you go home and you're kind of done, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how does a patient qualify for TIL therapy?
Yeah, so right now, unfortunately, this is still not a therapy for every patient. This is really a therapy for well, healthy patients that have recovered from all of their prior cancer therapy. So if patients are having ongoing side effects from immunotherapy, for example, they may not be a candidate for TIL because we can't give lots of T cells back and spin that back up. That can be very dangerous. But essentially, general rules here are this is for patients who have had melanoma that has spread, that have progressed on standard immunotherapy with a PD-1 medication. And if patients have a BRAF mutation, they also have to have had BRAF targeted therapy. This is something that can be used for cutaneous melanoma, for acral melanoma, for mucosal melanoma, and melanoma of unknown primary. Unfortunately, we don't yet have data for uveal melanoma, so this is not yet for uveal melanoma, but basically all of the other melanoma subtypes can be treated with AMTAGVI.
Yeah, that's actually great because, for some of the rarer subtypes like acral and mucosal, there aren't really good treatment options, and they usually present a more advanced disease. So, and they don't respond as well to the current therapies. So it's great that these patients could be included. And it's also good that there are ongoing clinical studies in the other rare subtype uveal melanoma. So, that is really fantastic. So what is, the treatment sounds a little rigorous at the beginning, before and after. What are like the side effects that you might get from the different components of it, and how do the clinicians deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thankfully for most of our patients, the surgery piece is usually something that is reasonably manageable. Often a day in outpatient surgery that the patient can go home the same day if we can take out a lymph node or something else. Sometimes we need to do a bigger surgery and take out a small piece of the liver or the lung to get a tumor. But surgery, obviously, while not minor, generally is something patients recover pretty quickly from. The lymphodepleting chemotherapy is usually the part that I will say most patients are most worried about, and actually is something that we can manage very, very well. So with this regimen, patients will lose their hair. they, if we gave no medicine, there would be a risk of nausea and vomiting, but we have lots and lots of really good preventative medicines now. So most patients have minimal, if any, nausea during that chemotherapy process. The
Great.
biggest risks are really the risk of infection because we are knocking down the immune system and the risk of bleeding. So unfortunately, when we give chemo, while we would love to just knock down the immune cells that we want, the red blood cells and the platelets, which help with clotting, get kind of caught in the crossfire. And so platelets can get low and there is a risk of bleeding, and that needs to be monitored really closely. And many patients will need blood and or platelet transfusions during this process until they recover while they're in the hospital. The cells themselves actually have very little toxicity. People do very well with the cell infusion, and the actual cells really don't cause a lot of side effects. The IL-2 is actually the toughest part of this regimen and the part that really limits what patients can be treated. So high dose IL-2 causes fevers and shaking chills. That is really from the activation of the immune response. It can cause something that's called capillary leak syndrome, which essentially means that all the fluid that's in the bloodstream and keeping up the blood pressure can start to leak out in the body. So people's hands and feet will tend to swell, but it can also cause fluid to accumulate in the lungs. It can cause the blood pressure to go low and sometimes need medications or fluids to keep that up. And it can cause actually damage to the kidneys if they're not seeing enough good fluid flow and the blood pressure gets too low. So IL-2 needs to be given very, very carefully and monitored really closely. And it's actually one of the biggest reasons that this is really limited to certain centers of excellence. All of that being said, these are, first of all, IL-2 is a very old medicine, and so many of us have a lot of experience giving it. And chemotherapy is something that as medical oncologists, we are extensively trained for years on. So not the nice part about this treatment, while it is difficult, is that the side effects are actually exceptionally predictable. We often know what they will be, and we have strategies to both prevent, but also pretty quickly change course if we need to.
Yeah, so and that's great to make these distinctions, because what I'm hearing is that, the TIL infusion is being given, as you said, by centers of excellence. You're all very aware of the problems that can occur and have managed these before and can, manage them with TIL therapy. So maybe that'll bring some comfort to people who are, thinking about getting this type of therapy.
Yeah, the other piece of that is that what we know, and if you look at the clinical trials that led to the approval of AMTAGVI, what we see is almost all the side effects are concentrated in the first 14 days. And that is actually when the patient is in the hospital. So
Okay.
unlike what we see with immunotherapy, sort of classically, where we have these long and ongoing side effects that can last days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years, what we see is a really tough several weeks. But by day 14 or 15 after the cells, there are very few, if any, new side effects that occur.
That's great. That's great. I would want to be in a hospital for you to be monitored if that was the thought of getting these side effects. So that is
Yeah.
comforting to hear. So you mentioned that there are centers of excellence who are administering these. So I guess there are a number of different sites that are being trained in the US on how to do this. And, can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the places that are authorized to give AMTAGVI are called authorized treatment centers. And these are places that have cell therapy capability. So there are very stringent rules that are put down, to make sure that we can give any cell therapy safely. So this is transplants and CAR T cells for other patients, to make sure that cells are handled properly and safely. So that is one of the requirements to be an authorized treatment center. And then, as you mentioned, very specific training around AMTAGVI itself. There are, somewhere in the 30 to 40 authorized treatment center range around the US. And patients can actually pretty easily find where that may be. So if patients go on the AMTAGVI website, which is literally amtagvi.com, there is a map, and you can put in your own zip code, and it will pull up a list of authorized treatment centers in your general region. We expect that will continue to expand, and hopefully we can bring this closer and closer to home for many patients. One of the challenges to this treatment is because it is a cell therapy, patients do need to be very close to the center, usually within 30 minutes to 60 minutes of the center that they're treated for 30 days from the day they get their cells, and are required to have a caregiver during that time. And so while it is right now there are only these sort of 30 to 40 centers, the hope obviously is to expand this much more widely so that patients don't have to travel so far to be able to get this care.
That's really great to know. So I'm just going to lead it in a little different direction. We've, been very fortunate that many of the immune therapies and targeted therapies have been approved in melanoma and now are actually approved in many other cancer types, which is amazing. We were like the poster child to start this wave of new approvals in other cancers. Do you anticipate that TIL therapy can be used for other solid tumors? And are there clinical trials being done that are testing this right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are already data for TIL therapy in lung cancer, and many, multiple ongoing trials of TIL therapy in lung cancer. There are data for head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, for cervical cancer, and breast cancer even. So this is coming. There is a clinical trial that is coming that is expanding this to colorectal cancer. So exactly as has happened with checkpoint blockade, with melanoma leading the charge, we are going to see this as well with TILs and likely other cell therapies as well.
It's really important news. Fingers crossed that the other cancers could be as fortunate as melanoma has been in terms of seeing responses. And I'm sure there'll be at major medical conferences in the future news on how these trials will be going. So are we actually trying to do research to figure out which patients might respond to TIL? Because as I mentioned at the beginning, for many of the approved therapies, only a certain percentage of patients actually get a good response and others don't. And I know we are trying to figure out why some people respond to immune checkpoints and others don't. So are we trying to do this? I mean, you have a research lab. You're not only is Dr. Betof Warner a medical oncologist, she's a wonderful researcher with a lab. So I thought maybe you could comment on those activities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually our highest priority right now. AMTAGVI is, as you said, offers a lot of new hope to patients. The response rate to this therapy for patients that have had standard immunotherapy is still only 31% based on the clinical trials. And so we need to make that better. We all know that, and we're working on it. And so what that means from our perspective is, looking at the pieces of the tumor that go into making the AMTAGVI product, studying what cells go back into the patient, and then looking at the blood, tumor, and other things in the patient characteristics to really try to understand which patients have good responses, which patients have bad responses, and how can we do two things. So one is, how can we select the right patients and spare the patients who aren't likely to benefit from going through this? And that is one approach. And the other is to say, can we find characteristics of these TILs that are more likely to work? And can we engineer the cells or enhance them in some way so that they work for more people? My lab is actively working on this and studying every patient that we're treating, as are labs all around the country and all around the world.
Yeah, because as you said, it's so important if a patient is, if we could have a better idea of which patients actually will not be likely to respond, to prevent them from going through this rigorous procedure would be, really be beneficial. And I think you just touched upon this, so I'll ask this before I'll ask questions from participants is, so, you mentioned that we're trying to improve the effectiveness of TILs. And, I know other companies are working on it. Can you just make some comments on that?
Yeah, I think there are many ways to improve the effectiveness of TILs. And the safety of TILs. So I think those are two things that are related. Right. So thinking about how do we create better cells. So the way that we expand those cells is one of the ways, and there's a clinical trial that is ongoing now with a drug called LYL845 that looks at a different media that we grow the cells in to hopefully make them work better, last longer. Um, and then thinking about how can we engineer the cells to have better properties, right? So things like knocking out the PD-1 gene so that the cells maybe don't exhaust as much and work for a longer time. Or different approaches. So one of the biggest challenges, as I mentioned earlier, to TIL therapy is the need for IL-2. And that really limits what patients we can treat. Patients who don't have perfect lung function and kidney function and all those things can't get IL-2. And so engineering in ways to stimulate those cells that don't need IL-2 makes this much safer and potentially more effective. And there's a clinical trial ongoing now that we have open here at Stanford with a molecule called OBX115 that actually does not require the use of IL-2. And so, while getting a drug approved was sort of one step, what I hope people are hearing is also we're already thinking 3 steps ahead of how to make this better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important in bringing new treatments forward is for the people in drug development to collaborate with the researchers to be able to do that 3-step ahead approach to be able to figure out, ways to improve these treatments and what next steps down the line will be. So I'm just going to turn to some participant questions. And one of them is that you mentioned that TILs might have less long-term effects, side effects. How many years of follow-up data after a treatment does it take to really track these long-term effects? Is it a year? Is it 5 years? Is it, 10
Yeah,
years?
it's a great question and one I think many of us are grappling with also. What we have for many of these patients is 2 to 3 years of follow-up from, the C-14401 trial, which was the trial that led to the approval of AMTAGVI. But we will continue to follow these patients for 5 years and 10 years and other things, looking for these longer term side effects. What I think is very promising and certainly reassuring to me as someone who gives this therapy frequently is that this is not completely new. And there are patients that were treated as early as 1988 with this therapy at the National Cancer Institute who are still doing very well and have not developed, side effects 10 years later from the TILs. And while we certainly need to see that in larger numbers of patients, at least that early signal, I think is reassuring.
Yeah, that's great. So how can patient advocates take part or help in expanding TIL access to more hospitals? Is there anything advocacy groups can actually do or work with the company or whatever? Any suggestions you can make? It's a great question.
It's a really great question. I think we need to be thoughtful about how quickly we expand this. We all want patients to have access to this as close to home as possible. That is in everyone's best interest. But what we need to do is also develop the expertise at centers to do this safely. This is really complex treatment. And even the ability to just give cells in any context and have an authorized cell facility, right, goes beyond melanoma. And so, I think continuing it from patient advocacy groups to advocate for expanding this as quickly as possible, but also providing support and access for patients who don't have a center close to them, right? Unfortunately, there is a lot of travel involved, and there are, means to support patients for those 30 days that they need to be near their center. For example, at our center, we help subsidize that housing, but their travel back and forth to the center and other things, right? There are a lot of out-of-pocket costs for patients. And so while we're pushing on, expanding the number of centers, that's going to take a year to multiple years for people to get trained to really do this safely, right? It's not just giving a drug and then walking away from the patient. There's really complex systems that need to be in place here. So I'd love to see advocacy groups sort of pressing on both of those at the same time.
Yeah, and I would just encourage patients who may be listening really to reach out to, foundations like the MRA, MRF, and, if you're experiencing any difficulties, we want to hear these stories and see where we can help. So I know it's coming to the close of our time, but so I'll end on one question. So what makes you particularly excited about this new treatment?
Yeah. When checkpoint blockade was approved, right, it was this brand new era of like a whole new option for patients who previously were told they didn't have an option. And this is that again, right? When patients now, prior to this approval, were progressing on checkpoint blockade or or targeted therapy, right? We were really into clinical trials, maybe chemotherapy, or talking about hospice conversations. And to have an option for patients that we can offer as a standard of care treatment that wasn't available before is just super exciting. But also this idea that it's a one-time treatment, right? That patients can get back to their lives eventually if they respond and are not on ongoing treatment. That is a completely new concept to solid tumor that we've never had an option for before.
That's really great. Really great. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Betof Warner, for joining us today. You've provided such excellent information and, really explain what the therapy is and really provided information that will make this whole process clearer, who can get it clearer. So we're really thankful to have you with us today. And I just want to thank all those who joined. And and it's still melanoma aware and skin cancer awareness month. So stay tuned.
Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to having more conversations about this.
Thank you.